A motorcycle went down hard on the ice, sparks flying across the road. The rider hit the ground and slid. Behind him, headlights swerved, tires locked, and 30 engines screamed against the storm. Nobody could stop. Nobody could turn. The temperature was dropping fast, and every man out there knew it. Their hands were freezing to the grips. Their leather had turned to sheets of ice. They were miles from anything warm, stranded on a dead country road in the worst weather any of them had ever ridden through. Then a porch light came on. An old woman in a housecoat stepped out into the sleet, a lantern shaking in her hand. Her name was Ruth, and she was 71 years old. What Ruth did next, for 30 strangers she had every reason to fear, would come back to her in a way nobody could have imagined. Stay with me. Now you have to understand something about Ruth Delacroix. She wasn't brave. She'd tell you that herself. She was a small woman with bad knees and a bad hip, and by the fall of 1987 she'd already buried more than most people bury in a lifetime. But when she looked out her kitchen window and saw those men down on the road, she didn't see a motorcycle gang. She saw people freezing to death. And Ruth Delacroix would not watch a human being freeze while she stood inside where it was warm. She and her husband Harlan had run a diner for 41 years, a little place off Route 9 outside a town called Cedar Hollow, Ohio. You know the kind. Vinyl booths patched with tape, coffee that never ran out. Ruth ran the kitchen, Harlan worked the counter, and between them they fed 3 generations of that county. Truckers, farmers, kids on their way to something better. Ruth never once let a hungry person walk out of her diner without eating, whether they had a dime or not. That was just how she was built. But the diner was gone now. They'd lost it 2 years back when the new highway went through and the traffic dried up and the bank stopped being patient. So Harlan and Ruth retired to the farmhouse where they'd raised their family, and they got old there. Quietly, the 2 of them and an old 3-legged sheepdog named Biscuit. And here's the part that matters. They were about to lose the farmhouse too. There was a paper pinned to the wall by the kitchen door. Ruth had put it there so she wouldn't forget, though God knows she couldn't forget it if she tried. It was an eviction notice. The farm had been mortgaged to keep the diner alive in its last years, and a developer out of Columbus had bought up the note, and they wanted the land. 30 acres for a shopping plaza. Ruth and Harlan had until the end of the month to get out. That was 17 days away. So that was the woman who stepped off the porch into the ice storm that night. A woman with nothing left and 17 days to lose it in. Harlan came out behind her, wrapping a scarf around his neck, moving slow the way he did now. He'd had a stroke the winter before and his left hand didn't work right anymore, but he could still get down to that road. And down they went, the 2 of them, an old man and an old woman, waving a lantern at 30 stranded bikers in the dark. The riders didn't know what to make of them. These were hard men, real ones, faded colors on their backs, beards frozen white, eyes that had seen the inside of more than one bad situation. A few of them, honestly, were the kind of men most folks crossed the street to avoid. And here came this tiny woman in a housecoat, hollering into the wind, telling them to get up off the road and follow her, that she had a barn and a fire and she was not going to argue about it. The one who seemed to be in charge was a big man they called Dutch, silver in his beard, a limp of his own. He looked at Ruth for a long moment. Then he looked at his men, half of them already going numb, one of them cradling a wrist he'd broken in the spill. And he made a decision that not everybody in that group agreed with. "Ma'am," he said, "we'll take you up on that." Harlan already had the barn doors open. He'd stacked firewood in there for the winter, dry oak, and he got a blaze going in the old stove while the bikers rolled their machines up out of the sleet. 30 men, filing into a barn on a farm that didn't even belong to these people anymore, though the bikers didn't know that yet. Biscuit, that old dog, went from man to man sniffing boots like he was taking attendance. And one by one those frozen, exhausted men reached down to scratch his ears. Even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. Ruth went back to the house and opened her pantry, and she looked at what she had. It wasn't much. When you're 17 days from eviction, you don't stock a full larder. She had a sack of flour, some eggs, a slab of bacon, a bag of potatoes, dried beans, an onion or two, coffee, and half a ham she'd been saving. Saving for what, she couldn't have told you. There was nothing left to save it for. She started cooking. And she did not stop for 9 hours. Now here's the thing about Ruth Delacroix. 41 years in a diner kitchen teaches your hands things your mind forgets. She made biscuits by the dozen, then by the dozens of dozens. She fried every strip of that bacon and every slice of that ham. She boiled the beans, mashed the potatoes, scrambled 2 flats of eggs, and made a pot of coffee so big she had to use the canning pot. Harlan carried the trays out to the barn, one at a time, slow, his good hand steady even when his bad one wasn't. Back and forth through the ice, an old man feeding an army. The bikers ate like they hadn't eaten in days. Some of them, maybe they hadn't. And a strange thing happened in that barn over those hours. The hardness started to come off them. They got quiet. Warm and fed and safe, they got quiet. And a couple of the younger ones had a shine in their eyes they were trying to hide. Because they'd all figured it out by then. You don't spend your life on the road without learning to read a house. They saw the bucket in the corner catching the leak from the barn roof. They saw the porch light dangling on a wire. They saw the way Harlan favored that dead hand, and the way this old couple gave away food they clearly could not spare to strangers without 1 second of hesitation. And Dutch, sometime around 3 in the morning, walked up to the farmhouse to thank Ruth in person. He stepped into that kitchen, and that's when he saw the paper on the wall. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there reading the eviction notice by the light of the stove while Ruth pulled another sheet of biscuits out of the oven. Delacroix, Harlan and Ruth Delacroix, 30 acres, 17 days. Dutch read it twice. Then his eye moved to the wall beside it where there were photographs, old ones curling at the corners. A wedding, 2 little girls in Sunday dresses, and a young man in an army uniform, maybe 19, 20 years old, grinning at the camera like he had the whole world in front of him. Dutch went very still when he saw that young man's face. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out rough. "Who's this in the picture here?" Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and looked over, and something crossed her face, a shadow, quick, before she smiled the way you smile when it costs you. "That's our Danny," she said. "Our son, he passed, long time ago now." Dutch didn't answer. He just looked at that photograph like a man who'd seen a ghost walk through the wall. And then he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," and he set down his coffee and he walked back out into the storm. There was a pay phone at the shuttered gas station a mile down Route 9. Dutch rode there alone in the dark on the ice, which tells you something about how bad he needed to make that call. He fed it every quarter he had, and whoever answered on the other end, Dutch talked to them for a long, long time. Nobody heard what he said, but before he hung up, the man who ran with 100 chapters and knew 10,000 riders by name said one sentence into that frozen phone. "I found them," he said. "After all these years, I finally found them." Then he rode back through the ice to the barn, and he lay down among his men and he didn't sleep. By dawn, the storm had passed. The world outside was glass, every branch and blade of grass sheathed in ice, and the sun came up over it and set the whole valley on fire with light. The bikers rose stiff and grateful. They rolled their machines out into the yard, and one by one they came to the porch to thank the old couple who'd saved their lives. They didn't have much to give. These weren't rich men, but they emptied their pockets and they left what they had on the kitchen table: a few crumpled bills, a pocket knife, a saint's medal on a chain. One young rider, the one with the broken wrist, took off his own gloves and pressed them into Harlan's hands and couldn't get a word out. Dutch was the last. He held Ruth's small hand in both of his big scarred ones, and he looked at her a long moment, and all he said was, "Ma'am, you have no idea what you did last night, but you will." Ruth thought that was just a nice thing to say, a biker being sweet. She smiled and told him to ride safe, and then 30 engines fired up in her frozen yard, and 30 men rode out onto Route 9, and the sound of them faded down the valley until it was gone. The silence came rushing back in behind it. Biscuit sat down in the middle of the empty yard and watched the road. Ruth went inside. She poured herself the last of the coffee. She sat down at her kitchen table for the first time in 9 hours, and her knees ached, and her back ached, and she looked at the little pile of gifts those men had left, and she cried a little. Then she wiped her eyes. Harlan sat down across from her and took her hand with his good one. "Well," he said, "that's that." And Ruth nodded. It was over. It was a beautiful thing that had happened, and it was over, and in 17 days they'd have to leave this house forever. She sipped her coffee. The morning was quiet and bright and still. It was, she thought, the most peaceful morning she'd had in a very long time. That peace lasted about 2 hours. It started as a sound. Far off, low, a rumble under the horizon, so faint at first that Ruth thought it was thunder rolling back for another round. She stood at the window with her coffee. Harlan came up beside her. The sound grew. It wasn't thunder. Thunder rises and fades. This built. It kept building deeper and wider until the coffee began to shiver in Ruth's cup, and the window panes buzzed in their frames, and Biscuit stood up on his 3 legs in the yard and started barking at the road. And then they came over the rise. Motorcycles, but not 30 of them. Ruth's mind couldn't do the math at first. The road filled with them, headlight after headlight after headlight, rank on rank, more than she had ever seen in one place in her whole life. A river of chrome and leather pouring down Route 9 toward her little farm. They kept coming, they kept coming. The rumble was so huge now she could feel it in her chest, in her teeth, in the floorboards under her feet. 800 Hell's Angels rolled into Ruth Delacroix's frozen yard that morning. They came from 4 states. They'd ridden all night, some of them, the moment the word went out from a pay phone at a shuttered gas station. And they did not come empty. Behind the bikes came the trucks, flatbeds stacked with lumber. Pickups loaded with shingles, with tools, with generators, with drums of nails and coils of wire and glass for windows. One truck carried nothing but food, because 800 men have to eat, and these men had no intention of taking one more thing from Ruth's pantry. Ruth walked out onto her sagging porch in her housecoat, and she put a hand over her mouth, and she could not speak. Dutch got off his bike and walked up to her, and this time there was no mystery in his face. He looked her dead in the eye. "Ma'am," he said, "last night you fed 30 of my brothers who'd have died out on that road. You gave away food you couldn't spare to men most folks would have run from. You didn't ask who we were. You didn't ask what we'd done. You just fed us." He looked back at the 800 men filling her yard. "We take care of our own, and as of last night, Ms. Delacroix, you're ours. So here's how today's going to go. You're going to sit on that porch and you're going to drink your coffee. And we're going to fix your house." And they did. I have to stop right here and say something to you. If you're still with me this far, if this story is getting to you the way it got to me, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button. That's all. It's free. It tells me you want more stories like this one, and there's a lot more of this story still to come, believe me. The best part hasn't happened yet. All right. Back to that frozen yard in Ohio, because what happened next didn't look like charity. It looked like a machine. These men had built and rebuilt more than one clubhouse in their day, and they knew how to work. Crews formed up without anyone shouting orders. One crew hit the roof, tearing off the rotten shingles that had leaked for 3 winters. Another crew jacked up the sagging porch and set new posts under it. Men crawled under the house to shore up the joists. Men rewired the porch light, replaced the cracked windows, chinked the gaps where the winter wind came through. The barn roof, the one with the bucket under it, was stripped and redone before noon. Ruth sat on her own porch in a good chair somebody had carried out for her, with a blanket over her knees and a fresh cup of coffee she hadn't made, and she watched 800 Hell's Angels rebuild her home around her. Biscuit lay at her feet, thumping his tail every time a biker walked by, which was constantly. Harlan stood at the top of the steps and tried to help, and a big angel with a gray ponytail gently took the hammer out of his good hand and said, "Sir, you've done your work. It was 41 years long. We got it from here. But I told you the trouble wasn't over, and it wasn't, because around 1 o'clock a county sheriff's car came up the road, and behind it came a shiny black sedan, and the whole thing nearly went sideways. The man who got out of the sedan was from the developer in Columbus, wore a good coat, carried a leather folder. He'd come out to inspect the property he was about to take, and he had a sheriff's deputy with him to make the point official. And he arrived to find his 30 acres covered in 800 outlaw bikers and a house being rebuilt on land he considered already his. He was not happy. He marched up toward the porch with his folder, the deputy trailing nervous behind him, and he started in loud. This was private property. This construction was unauthorized. These improvements meant nothing because the Delacroix were in default and would be removed by court order in 16 days, and every nail these people drove was a waste, and he'd have them all cleared off for trespassing if they weren't gone by. He stopped. He stopped because the work had stopped. All around the yard, one by one, 800 men had set down their tools and turned to look at him. Nobody said a word. The only sound was the wind and a generator idling somewhere. 800 men just looking. The developer's mouth was still open, but nothing was coming out of it anymore. And this, right here, is where the whole thing changed its shape. Because up until now it had been a story about kindness, about strangers and a storm and a good meal. But now Ruth understood, sitting in her chair with her heart pounding, that the men in her yard weren't just fixing a roof. They had come to fight the thing that was taking her home, and the thing taking her home wasn't a storm you could outcook. It was a man with a folder and a county behind him. This was a different kind of enemy, and it was going to take a different kind of stand. Dutch walked over to the developer, slow, unhurried. He was a full head taller than the man from Columbus. "You hold the note on this place," Dutch said. It wasn't a question. The developer swallowed and said the loan was in default and the law was the law. "How much?" Dutch said. The developer blinked. "Excuse me." "The note," Dutch said. "The whole thing. Principal, interest, penalties, whatever paper you're holding. What's the number to make it disappear?" The developer named a figure. He named it with a little smile because it was a big figure, a number meant to end the conversation. $68,000 and change. He figured that settled it. He figured no biker club had that kind of money sitting around, and he was mostly right about that. Dutch turned around and faced the yard. And he lifted his voice, so it carried over all 800 of them. "Brothers," he called out, "you heard the man." And the second thing happened in Ruth Delacroix's yard that day that she would never forget as long as she lived. Because those men started walking forward, reaching into their vests, their saddlebags, their boots. Some of them had ridden in already knowing, because Dutch had told them on the phone what this was. They came up one at a time and they put money down on the hood of that black sedan. Crumpled bills, rolls of it. Some men put down 100. Some put down 1,000. One silent giant of a man laid down the pink slip to a Harley and said, "Sell it." They dug deep. 800 men who most of the world had written off as nothing but trouble, emptying their pockets on the hood of a car to save the home of two old people they had met the night before or never met at all. It took 20 minutes. Dutch counted it twice on the hood of the car while the developer stood there gone pale. And when it was counted, it was more than $68,000. It was enough, with room to spare. Dutch didn't hand it over. He picked up the developer's own leather folder off the hood, opened it, found the payoff document, and set it down in front of the man with a pen on top of it. "You're going to sign this note paid in full," Dutch said, quiet now, almost gentle. "Right here, in front of the deputy so it's witnessed and it's real. And then you're going to get in your car, and you're never going to send these people another piece of paper as long as you live. We clear?" The deputy, God bless him, took off his hat and said, "That all be legal far as I can see." The developer signed. His hand was shaking. He signed the note paid in full, and the deputy witnessed it, and Dutch folded the paper into his vest and stepped back. And the man from Columbus got into his shiny black car with the money he'd demanded and drove away with the deed to nothing, and he never came back. Ruth watched his taillights go down Route 9 and disappear over the rise, the same rise the bikers had come over that morning, and she realized her hands were pressed together like she was praying, and maybe she was. The house was theirs. Free and clear. For the first time in years, Harlan and Ruth Delacroix owned the ground they stood on, and nobody could take it. Ruth started to get up to thank Dutch, to thank all of them, to say something, anything, but her voice was gone and her legs wouldn't hold her. And that's when it got even bigger, because Dutch came and knelt down in front of her chair so they were eye to eye, and he took off his glasses, and Ruth saw that this enormous hard old man had tears running straight down into his gray beard. "Ma'am," he said, "there's something I have to tell you, and I don't rightly know how." He reached into his vest, past the paid-off note, and he took out a photograph of his own, old and creased and soft from being carried a long time. He put it in Ruth's hands, and Ruth looked down and the world stopped. It was her Danny. It was her son. Younger than in the picture on her wall in jungle fatigues, his arm slung around the shoulder of another young soldier, both of them grinning in the sun. And the other young soldier, 40 years and a hard life later, was kneeling in front of her chair right now with tears in his beard. "His name was Danny Delacroix," Dutch said, and his voice broke on it. "1969, Vietnam, he was my squad leader. He was 19 years old and he was the best of all of us. He had to stop and breathe. Our position got overrun. I took 2 rounds and I went down in the open, and there wasn't a man alive would have come out for me in that. And Danny came out for me. He picked me up and he carried me back under fire and he got me to the medevac and he went back out." Dutch pressed his lips together. "He didn't come back that time. He was 20 years old, ma'am. He gave his life so I could have mine." Ruth was holding the photograph to her chest, now with both hands. "I spent 40 years trying to find his people," Dutch said. "All I ever had was a name and a state. Delacroix, Ohio. I swear to you I looked all my life so I could tell his mother and father what their boy did, what he was, and I never found you." He looked around at the rebuilt house, the 800 silent men, the ice melting off the trees. "Until last night. Until you walked out into that storm and fed 30 strangers, and I walked into your kitchen and I saw his face on your wall." He shook his head, wonder and grief all mixed together. "Your boy saved my life in 1969, and last night, without ever knowing it, you saved my brother's lives too. That's not luck, ma'am. I don't have a word for what that is. But I owed a debt to this family for 40 years, and today I finally got to pay it." Ruth couldn't speak. She reached out and put her small hand against the side of that big man's wet face, the way a mother would, and he closed his eyes and let her. And it was right then, into that silence, That old Biscuit got up on his 3 legs and started barking. He barked toward the back of the property, toward the barn, and then he trotted off around the side of it. And when nobody followed fast enough, he came back and barked again, insistent, the way that dog did when he wanted you to see something. Ruth wiped her face and pushed herself up out of the chair, and this time her legs held her, and she followed the dog. Harlan came behind her and Dutch, and slowly the whole yard began to move, 800 men falling into step behind one small old woman and a 3-legged dog. Biscuit led her around the back of the barn, to the corner of the property under the old oak tree, and Ruth stopped, and her hand went to her mouth again. There was a grave back there, Danny's grave. He'd been brought home from Vietnam in 1969 and buried on the family land under that oak, because Ruth couldn't bear to have him anywhere she couldn't see from her kitchen window. But the truth was, in the last few years, with Harlan's stroke and Ruth's knees and everything falling down around them, they hadn't been able to keep it the way they wanted. The stone had gone gray and green. The grass had grown up wild. It shamed Ruth to admit it, but she hadn't been able to get back there to tend her own boy's grave in over a year. And now she saw what the bikers had done. While she'd been sitting on the porch, while the note was being paid, a crew of them had come back here quietly and gone to work. They'd cleared the brush. They'd cut the grass down clean. They'd scrubbed the headstone until Danny's name shone white again in the winter sun. They'd set fresh flowers against it, and planted an evergreen at each corner, and driven a new flagpole into the earth beside the stone. And on that pole, snapping in the cold, clean wind off the melting fields, flew an American flag, and beneath it, the colors of the club. Every one of those 800 men, as they came around the barn and saw the grave of the soldier who'd started all of this, took off his hat. Nobody said a word. 800 bikers stood bareheaded in the cold around the grave of a 20-year-old boy who'd been gone longer than most of them had been alive. A boy whose one act of courage in a jungle half a world away had, across 40 years, reached all the way to this frozen Ohio farm and saved his own mother and father from losing everything. Biscuit walked up to the headstone, the way he must have 100 times, and lay down in front of it in the fresh-cut grass and put his chin on his paws. Ruth knelt down at her son's grave. She ran her fingers over his clean white name, and she wept, not the way you weep from sorrow, but the way you weep when something you thought was broken forever turns out to have been held, all along, in hands you never knew were there. Harlan knelt beside her, slow, his bad hand and his good hand both flat on the stone, and the old man who'd hardly spoken all day put his forehead down against his boy's name and let it all go. Dutch stood behind them with his hat over his heart. "He'd be proud of you," he said softly. "Both of you. Look what you raised. Look what came back around." The Hell's Angels stayed 3 more days. They finished every last thing. New roof, new porch, new windows, a rebuilt barn, a repainted house. They stocked Ruth's pantry to the ceiling and filled her woodshed for the winter. And they built one thing more without being asked. At the head of the drive, out by Route 9, they raised a small new sign. It read Danny's Diner. Because they'd talked it over and they weren't going to let Ruth Delacroix's cooking die on that farm. They'd help her open the doors again. Right there in the barn they'd made sound, and they did. And it ran for years, and every rider in 4 states knew that if you were cold and hungry and out on Route 9, there was a place that would feed you no matter what you had in your pockets. Same as it ever was. Dutch came back every autumn, right around the anniversary of that ice storm, until the year he couldn't anymore. He'd sit at the counter and drink Ruth's coffee, and talk to Harlan about a boy they'd both loved. And when Ruth finally passed, an old woman in a house that was fully and forever her own, there were more motorcycles at her funeral than the little Cedar Hollow cemetery had ever seen. Engines idling low and respectful, 800 strong and then some, come to carry home one of their own. So the next time you see a line of them come rumbling down the road, all that leather and chrome and noise, and you feel that old instinct to look away, remember Ruth. Remember a 71-year-old woman who walked out into an ice storm with a shaking lantern because she couldn't stand to watch anybody freeze. She didn't do it to be repaid. She did it because that was who she was. And that, in the end, is the only kind of kindness that ever comes back around. The kind you give away expecting nothing at all. She fed 30 freezing strangers on the worst night of the year, and the whole world came back to rebuild her life, every board of it, right down to the flag flying over her son.